Edward Augustus Freeman was an English historian, architectural artist, Liberal politician during the late 19th century heyday of William Gladstone, and a one-time candidate for Parliament. He held the position of Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, where he tutored Arthur Evans. Later he and Evans would be activists in the Balkan uprising of Bosnia and Herzegovina against the Ottoman Empire. After the marriage of his daughter Margaret to Evans, he and Evans collaborated on the fourth volume of his History of Sicily. He was a prolific writer, publishing 239 distinct works. One of his best known is his magnum opus, the six-volume The History of the Norman Conquest of England. Both he and Margaret died before Evans purchased the land from which he would excavate the Palace of Knossos. Biography. Early life. Freeman was born at Metchley Abbey in Harborne, now a suburb of Birmingham. His parents, John Freeman and Mary Ann, used the Latin name of the month in which he was born as his middle name. They were a family of modest means, however. Their paternal grandfather, Joseph Freeman, had been a wealthy man, and the owner of Pedmore Hall. On his death, his will was disputed, and lawyers' fees consumed the bulk of the estate. Edward's father, the oldest son, and his two paternal uncles, Keelinge and Joseph, received little to sustain him. Edward's mother, Mary Ann, née Acuti Carlus, had noble ancestry, descending through her father, William, then residing near Birmingham, from the same Colonel William Carlus who had assisted the future Charles II as he hid from his enemies in the branches of the Royal Oak after the Battle of Worcester, 1651, the last of the English Civil War. Mary Ann's family still displayed the coat of arms given to them. The family was never in good health. They delayed baptizing Edward for a year, hoping to avoid public exposure to contagious diseases. The family was struck by tragedy in November 1824, when the father died of unknown disease. The mother died 4 days later of tuberculosis, and the oldest daughter, Mary Ann, then aged 14, died of unknown disease the same day, the 25th of November. Edward's paternal grandmother, Emma Freeman, immediately took charge of the three survivors, Edward and his two sisters, Sarah and Emma, aged 13 and 10 respectively, bringing them to her home at Weston-super-Mare. Emma died in 1826 when Edward was 3 years old. Education and marriage. Freeman was educated at private schools and by a private tutor. Even as a boy, he was interested in religious matters, history and foreign politics. He won a scholarship to Trinity College, Oxford, and a second class in the degree examination, and was elected Fellow of his college. While at Oxford he was much influenced by the High Church movement, and thought seriously of taking orders, but abandoned the idea. He married a daughter of his former tutor, the Reverend R. Gutch, in 1847, and entered on a life of study. After some changes of residence, Freeman bought a house called Summerleys, near Wells, Somerset, and settled there in 1860. Death. From 1886, Freeman was forced by ill health to spend much of his time abroad. In February 1892 he visited Spain in company with his wife and 2 younger daughters. He fell ill at Valencia on the 7th of March, but on the 9th went on to Alicante, where his illness proved to be smallpox. He died at Alicante on the 16th, and was buried in the Protestant cemetery there. He left 2 sons and 4 daughters. The inscription on his gravestone was written by his son-in-law Sir Arthur Evans. Career. Politician. Freeman involved himself in politics, was a follower of Gladstone, and approved the Home Rule Bill of 1886, but objected to the later proposal to retain the Irish members at Westminster. To enter Parliament was one of his ambitions, and in 1868 he unsuccessfully contested mid-Somerset. Foreign rather than domestic politics were his main interest. He expressed an antipathy for the Turks and was sympathetic with the smaller and subject nationalities of Eastern Europe. He was prominent in the agitation which followed the Bulgarian atrocities of the April Uprising. His speeches were often intemperate, and he was accused of uttering the words "Perish India" at a public meeting in 1876. This, however, was a misrepresentation of his words. He was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Saviour by the King of Greece, and also received an order from the Prince of Montenegro. In a letter to a friend, describing America, Freeman wrote, "This would be a grand land if only every Irishman would kill a Negro, and be hanged for it." For some years he was an active county magistrate. He served on the Royal Commission on Ecclesiastical Courts, being appointed in 1881. Historian, he was made GCL. of Oxford and LD. of Cambridge honoris causa, and when he visited the United States on a lecture tour was well received at various institutions of learning. In 1884 he was appointed Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, and was, for a time, a non-resident professor at Cornell University. Freeman advanced the study of history in England in two directions: by insistence on the unity of history, and by teaching the importance and right use of primary sources. Politics was at the core, for he often said, "History is past politics and politics present history." He urged that history not be divided by a middle wall of partition into ancient and modern, nor broken into fragments as though the history of each nation stood apart. He declared it more than a collection of narratives, deeming it a science. The science of man and his political character. Freeman asserted that the historical student should view all history as within his range, and have his own special range within which he masters every detail. Freeman's range included Greek, Roman and the earlier part of English history, together with some portions of foreign medieval history, and he had a scholarly though general knowledge of the rest of the history of the European world. Freeman regarded Rome as the central truth of European history, the bond of its unity, and he undertook his history of Sicily partly to illustrate this unity. He believed that all historical study is valueless unless based on a knowledge of original authorities, and explained how they should be weighed and used. He did not use manuscript authorities, however, and maintained he had no need to do so for most of his work, as the authorities he needed were already in print. His reputation as a historian rests chiefly on his History of the Norman Conquest, his longest completed book. In common with his works generally, it is distinguished by exhaustiveness of treatment and research, critical ability, and general accuracy. He is almost exclusively a political historian, and his works are infused with personal insights he gained from his practical experience of people and institutions. His saying that history is past politics and politics are present history is significant of this limitation of his work, which dealt less with other subjects in a nation's life. J.W. Burrow proposed that Freeman, like William Stubbs and John Richard Green, was an historical scholar with little or no experience of public affairs, with views of the present which were romantically historicized, and who was drawn to history by what was in a broad sense an antiquarian passion for the past, as well as a patriotic and populist impulse to identify the nation and its institutions as the collective subject of English history, making the new historiography of early medieval times an extension, filling out and democratizing, of older Whig notions of continuity. It was Stubbs who presented this most substantially, Green who made it popular and dramatic. It is in Freeman, of the three the most purely a narrative historian, that the strains are most apparent. Works. Architecture. Freeman had a particular interest in ecclesiastical architecture and visited many churches. He soon began a practice of making drawings of buildings on the spot and afterwards tracing them over in ink. His first book, except for his share in a volume of English verse, was a history of architecture. Though he had not then seen any buildings outside England, it contains a good sketch of the development of the art. In 1851 he published an essay on the origin and development of window tracery in England, which proposed the terms flowing and flamboyant instead of Thomas Rickman's decorated, which had been generally adopted since it was first published in 1817. The same year Edmund Sharp published an alternative proposal, The Seven Periods of English Architecture, dividing the fenestration of the decorated period between a geometrical period to 1315 followed by a curvilinear period to 1360. Though Rickman's scheme remains in use, the subdivisions proposed by both Freeman and Sharp are also often found in recent books, historical works and journalism. Freeman's life was marked by a prodigious literary output. His published scholarly works include the 15 large volumes of Norman Conquest, his unfinished History of Sicily, and his William Rufus. He wrote several others on the early Middle Ages, and produced works on Aratus, Sulla, Nicias, William the Conqueror, Thomas of Canterbury, Frederick II, and many more. He was also interested in Switzerland and in comparative constitutional history. Freeman wrote articles for various other publications, including reviews for newspapers and other periodicals, and was a prolific contributor to the Saturday Review until 1878, when he ceased to write for it for political reasons. The naturalist William Henry Hudson was dismissive of Freeman's style of argument in his 1920 book Dead Man's Plaque and an Old Thorn, Books and Papers. Freeman's personal library of some 6,500 volumes was bought for Owens College by the trustees of Sir Joseph Whitworth, and there it remains, though no longer kept together. A catalogue of it was issued by the college. Most of the Freeman collection is at the University of Manchester Library, including works in manuscript, correspondence, and 6,200 of his architectural sketches of European churches. Bibliography. This article incorporates text from a publication now in the public domain. Chisholm, Hugh, ed. Encyclopaedia Britannica. Cambridge University Press. By Freeman. Freeman, Edward A. The History of the Norman Conquest of England, Its Causes and Its Results. Volume 1. The Preliminary History to the Election of Edward the Confessor. Oxford, Clarendon Press. The History of the Norman Conquest of England, Its Causes and Its Results. Volume 4. The Reign of William the Conqueror. Oxford, Clarendon Press. The History of the Norman Conquest of England, Its Causes and Its Results. Volume 5. The Effects of the Norman Conquest. Oxford, Clarendon Press. Freeman, Edward A. The Historical Geography of Europe. London, Longmans, Green and Company. Freeman, Edward A. Comparative Politics with the Unity of History. London, Macmillan & Co., Limited. About Freeman. G.A. Bremner and Jonathan Conline, History as Form, Architecture and Liberal Anglican Thought in the Writings of E. A. Freeman, Modern Intellectual History, Volume 8, 299–326. Bryce, James, E. A. Freeman, English Historical Review, July 1892. De Sanctis. Freeman and European History 141 pp. Harrison, Frederick Tennyson, Ruskin, Mill and Other Literary Estimates. London. Lerner, Robert E. Turner in The Revolt Against Each Freeman, Arizona and the West. 101–108. In JSTOR. Parker, J.W. The Failure of Liberal Racialism. The Racial Ideas of Each Freeman. Historical Journal 24.04. 825–846. Stevens, W.R.W. The Life and Letters of Edward A. Freeman, D.C.L. Ull. D. Volume I. London, New York. Macmillan & Co. The Life and Letters of Edward A. Freeman, D.C.L. Ull. D. Volume 2. London, New York. Macmillan & Co. Stevenson, Paul. Each Freeman, a neglected commentator on Byzantium and modern Greece. Historical Review, La Revue Historique 4. 119–156. Walton, Susan. Charlotte M. Young and the Historic Harem of Edward Augustus Freeman, Journal of Victorian Culture 11 No. 2 pp. 226–255. Online.